The air on the southern steps of Mount Moriah is no longer the air of prayer. It is a thick, choking veil of ash and the metallic tang of blood. Eleazar stands there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He is a young man, barely in his late 20s, a priest of the course of Bilga. His white linen tunic, once a symbol of ritual purity, is now singed at the edges and stained with the grime of a city under siege. His face, streaked with soot and dried blood, is turned toward the rising heat. Around him, the world he was born to serve is disintegrating. The great Lebanese cedar beams of the royal stoa are roaring as they succumb to the flames, sending sparks into a sky already darkened by the smoke of a dying era. To his left, the rhythmic, terrifying clatter of the Roman 10th Legion as they breach the court of the women drowns out the last cries of the Levites. In the chaos, Eleazar hears a sound that will haunt his memory. The sharp, discordant ring of silver trumpets striking the paving stones, discarded in the panic. He clutches a small fragment of parchment, a scrap of the law, as if it were the only solid thing left in a dissolving universe. It is August, the year 70, and the house of God is no longer a sanctuary. It has become a fortress under terminal assault, a pyre for the hopes of a nation. This is the physical collapse of the world as Eleazar knew it, the moment the stones began to cry out. Eleazar watches the gold of the sanctuary melt under the intense heat, a sight that feels like the undoing of creation itself. To the world watching from the outside, this was the Roman suppression of a provincial revolt. But for those within these walls and for the centuries of history that would follow, this was a tectonic shift that would reshape Western civilization. Jerusalem was not merely a provincial capital. Through the ambitious masonry of Herod the Great, it had become one of the wonders of the Roman world, a city of white marble and gold, that the historian Flavius Josephus described as appearing like a mountain covered in snow. Evidence of this total devastation is not found only in the ink of ancient historians, but in the very soil of the city. Archaeologists excavating the burnt house in the upper city have uncovered the soot-blackened stones and the charred remains of a world that ended in a single afternoon. This was the moment. The warnings recorded in the Synoptic Gospels moved from prophecy to terrifying reality. As Eleazar grips his parchment, his mind reeling from the roar of the flames, he faces the existential question that would define the future of both Judaism and the burgeoning Christian movement. How can a faith centered on animal sacrifice and a physical dwelling place of God endure when the altar is turned to rubble? For Eleazar, the tragedy was not just the Roman iron now breaching the inner courts, but the haunting memory of the months leading up to this, when the city had already begun to break from within. As the heat from the temple's destruction radiates against his skin, Eleazar's mind retreats to the bitter months that preceded this final agony. He remembers that before the Romans ever breached the outer walls, Jerusalem had already begun to devour itself. The city was a cauldron of internal strife, fractured between the radical zealots, the dagger-wielding Sicarii, and the moderate priestly aristocracy to which Eleazar's family belonged. It is a grim detail of the period, recorded by the historian Flavius Josephus, that in the early stages of the revolt, more Jewish lives were lost to the daggers of internal factions than to the swords of the Roman legions. The physical evidence of this defiant, fractured hope remains with us today in the form of revolt coins found in the city's ruins. Minted by the rebels during the years of the uprising, these coins bear the proud inscription for the freedom of Zion. They speak of a nation attempting to assert its sovereignty even as its foundations crumbled. Yet, for a priest like Eleazar, those slogans felt hollow when he stood in the streets and watched the smoke rise from the city's own granaries. In a desperate bid to force the population into a total, suicidal war, rival Jewish factions had set fire to the massive stores of grain that could have sustained the city for years. To see the bread of the people turned to ash by the hands of their own brothers was a heartbreak that rivaled the Roman presence outside the gates. For Eleazar, the tragedy of the temple's fall was merely the final act of a city that had already broken its own heart from within. While the city bled from its internal wounds, a far more disciplined force tightened its grip from the outside. Titus, the eldest son of the Emperor Vespasian, arrived at the head of 4 veteran legions, bringing the Roman war machine to its most efficient and terrifying peak. To ensure no one escaped and no supplies entered, the Romans constructed a circumvallation wall, a massive siege fortification encircling the entire city. Historical accounts claim this 5-mile circuit was completed in just 3 days, a feat of engineering that turned the holy city into a tomb for the living. The physical reality of this pressure is still visible in the archaeology of the city today. Near the remains of the third wall, excavators have recovered massive ballista stones, some weighing over 100 pounds. These were the heavy artillery of the ancient world, launched with enough force to shatter both stone and bone. Among historians, a debate persists regarding Titus's true intentions. Flavius Josephus, writing with Roman favor, claims Titus sought to save the temple as a monument to his own clemency. Yet other sources, such as those preserved by the chronicler Sulpicius Severus, suggest the destruction was a calculated blow meant to uproot the Jewish superstition at its source. From his position on the ramparts, Eleazar watches as the Roman Scorpio engines are wheeled into place. He hears the watchman's haunting cry as the white limestone projectiles arc through the sky. The sun is coming. This cryptic warning, perhaps a pun on the Hebrew words for stone and sun, or a reference to the blinding white missiles against the blue Judean sky, signaled the arrival of a judgment that had been foretold decades before. For Eleazar, it was the sound of a closing trap, the physical manifestation of a prophecy that was now raining down upon his head. As the stones shatter the buildings of the upper city, one cannot help but recall the weight of the biblical text that hung over these walls long before the first Roman legion arrived. 40 years earlier, Jesus of Nazareth stood on the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley at this very skyline. The Gospel of Luke records his lament, a moment where he wept over the city, foreseeing a day when enemies would build an embankment around her and hem her in on every side. In Matthew's account, the warning is even more harrowing in its architectural precision. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. To the priests of the courses like Eleazar, such a statement would have sounded like madness. The temple was the footstool of God, seemingly as eternal as the heavens. Yet, for the early Christian community, these words were a mandate for survival. The 4th century historian Eusebius of Caesarea preserves a tradition that many of these believers, heeding the prophetic warnings, fled Jerusalem before the Roman lines were fully drawn. They crossed the Jordan to the city of Pella, escaping the carnage that was about to unfold. While the defenders of Zion braced for a miraculous deliverance, the followers of the way saw the inevitable end of an era. If you want to go beyond this episode and see the wider historical world around the Bible, I gathered these studies in my book. There I go deeper into maps, empires, chronology, sources, and disputed questions that cannot fit fully into one video. The link to the book is in the description. Now let us return to the person at the center of this story and to the world he had to live through. Eleazar does not have the luxury of distance or the clarity of hindsight. He is trapped in the present, where the air is thick with the scent of burning Lebanese cedar and the copper tang of blood. The Roman legions have finally broken into the inner courts, their rage boiling over after months of grueling siege. Amidst the screams and the clatter of iron, a Roman soldier reaches for a piece of burning timber. In a moment that would change the course of history, he hurls the torch through a golden window into the chambers of the sanctuary. Eleazar watches, his face illuminated by a sudden terrifying orange glow, as the fire takes hold of the curtains and the sacred wood, beginning the final consumption of the heart of his world. It is the 9th day of the month of Av, the peak of a blistering summer. but the heat radiating from the sanctuary now dwarfs the sun. Flavius Josephus, who watched the catastrophe unfold from the Roman lines, records that the soldiers were driven by a frenzy that no command could check. Though Titus had reportedly intended to preserve the temple as a trophy of Roman greatness, his legions, exhausted and embittered by months of grueling warfare, saw only a hoard of gold and a symbol of stubborn resistance that had to be extinguished. They ignored the shouts of their commanders, fueled by a collective rage that had moved beyond the reach of discipline. Eleazar stumbles back as the fire leaps from the Lebanese cedar beams to the heavy tapestries. Josephus's description of this moment is hauntingly graphic. He writes of the blood of the slain flowing in such volume that it seemed to compete with the very fires, cascading down the white marble steps of the altar like a crimson river. For a priest like Eleazar, the spiritual horror surpasses the physical agony. As he retreats toward the southern perimeter, he looks back to see the Roman standards, the silver eagles, being planted in the sacred courts. The legionaries, in a final act of triumph, offer sacrifices to these images in the very place where only the nameless God of Israel was to be honored. To any first-century witness, this was the abomination of desolation spoken of in the scrolls, a desecration that signaled the terminal breath of the old world. Desperate to escape the slaughter, Eleazar descends into the darkness of the stone drainage tunnels that run beneath the city, the same Siloam tunnels where modern archaeologists have discovered the cooking pots and bronze coins of those who huddled in the damp shadows while their world burned above. As he moves through the dark, a thunderous crash echoes from the surface, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. It is the sound of the massive stones of the temple being heaved into the streets by Roman levers. Among them is the trumpeting place stone, a monumental block inscribed with the Hebrew words, "To the place of trumpeting." For years, Eleazar had heard the silver trumpet sound from that very corner to announce the arrival of the Sabbath. Now that stone lies smashed in the dust of the Herodian street, a silent witness to a silence that would last for generations. What Eleazar experiences in the suffocating darkness of those tunnels, the earth itself has preserved for us to witness nearly 2,000 years later. Archaeology does not merely suggest the scale of this catastrophe, it provides a grim forensic confirmation of the literary accounts. In the 1970s, during excavations of the upper city, researchers uncovered what is now known as the Burnt House, the residence of the Catros family of priestly lineage. Within its ruins, they found a layer of ash and soot so thick it had sealed the final moments of the household in place. Most hauntingly, they discovered a spear leaning against a wall and the skeletal arm of a young woman who had died in the flames, a silent physical echo of the chaos Eleazar now hears muffled through the stone. The violence of the Roman demolition is etched into the very pavement of Jerusalem. Near the base of the Temple Mount, beneath the area known as Robinson's Arch, the massive Herodian street remains visible today. The heavy paving stones are not merely worn, they are deeply indented and fractured by the colossal force of the temple's masonry being heaved from the ramparts above. These are the stones that Josephus described falling like thunder, cast down by the Roman soldiers in their systematic effort to erase the Jewish stronghold. When we look at these shattered slabs, we see the literal fulfillment of a city being leveled to its foundations. For a man like Eleazar, crawling through the damp earth as the vibrations of the falling stones rattle his teeth, this was not just a lost war or the destruction of a building, it was the apparent silence of God. The smoke rising into the Judean sky was the only answer to the prayers of a nation, leaving the survivors to wonder if the covenant itself had been consumed in the fire or if it was being transformed into something they could not yet imagine. While Eleazar struggles for breath in the dark tunnels beneath the city, the sacred objects he once handled with ritual purity are already being prepared for a journey across the Mediterranean. The silver trumpets that called the people to prayer, the golden table of showbread, and the great seven-branched menorah are no longer holy vessels. They have been redefined as war trophies. If we travel from the ruins of Jerusalem to the heart of Rome, we find these very items immortalized in stone on the Arch of Titus. This triumphal monument standing near the Roman Forum features a vivid relief carving of Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of the temple through the streets in a victory procession. For the historian, this is an external source of immense value, providing a contemporary visual record of the temple's furniture. For the new Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his son Titus, this victory was the cornerstone of their political legitimacy. They broadcast their triumph to the ends of the empire through the Judea Capta coins, which depicted a mourning woman sitting beneath a palm tree overseen by a Roman soldier. The humiliation of the Judean people was also institutionalized through the Fiscus Judaicus. The half-shekel tax that Eleazar's ancestors had sent to the temple for generations was now forcibly diverted to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. The wealth of the God of Israel was used to adorn the sanctuary of a Roman deity, yet the Arch of Titus presents a mystery that remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. In the relief, the base of the menorah is decorated with carvings of sea monsters and eagles, motifs that seem to contradict the strict biblical prohibitions against graven images. Some historians argue this was merely Roman artistic liberty, a Romanized version of the lampstand created by the sculptors who had never seen the original. Others suggest it might reflect a specific Herodian design, indicating how deeply Hellenistic influence had seeped into the temple's aesthetics during the late Second Temple period. Regardless of its exact form, the image on the arch remains the most poignant visual record of the sanctuary's end. To the Romans, it was an arch of triumph. To Eleazar and his kin, it was an arch of grief, marking the moment their holiest treasures were marched into the heart of a pagan empire, seemingly never to return. As the smoke begins to drift toward the Mediterranean, settling over a landscape forever changed, we are forced to ask the same question Eleazar must have asked as he crawled from the darkness of the tunnels into the ruins of the upper city. How does a faith rooted in a specific piece of ground survive when that ground is salted with ash? For centuries, the presence of God was tied to the smoke of the morning and evening sacrifice. Without the altar, the identity of a priest like Eleazar was effectively erased. Yet in the shadow of this total collapse, a profound transformation was taking place. Historical tradition preserves a story of survival that stands in stark contrast to the suicide pacts of the zealots. It is said that Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, one of the leading sages of the era, realized that if the temple was the only container for the faith, then the faith would die with the stones. According to later accounts, he was smuggled out of the besieged city in a coffin, pretending to be a corpse, to pass through the gates held by Jewish factions and reach the Roman camp. His request to Vespasian was not for power or wealth, but for the town of Yavne and its sages. This moment marks a tectonic shift in Western history, the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. The center of gravity moved from the physical sacrifice of animals to the study of the Torah and the practice of prayer. The house of God was no longer a single building in Jerusalem, but any place where the community gathered to study the Word. For the burgeoning Christian movement, the destruction of the temple carried a different yet equally transformative weight. Looking through the lens of faith reflection, many early believers saw the ruins as a confirmation of the warnings of Jesus and a sign that the physical shadows of the old order were giving way to a new reality. The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, likely writing around this period of upheaval, speaks of a true temple not made with hands and a high priesthood that did not depend on the genealogy of men like Eleazar. For them, the fire was not an end, but a transition from the visible to the eternal. We can infer that this was the moment when both Judaism and Christianity were forced to define themselves not by their geography but by their text. The scrolls became the new homeland. Eleazar, standing amidst the rubble of the royal stoa, might not yet have understood that the parchment he clutched was more durable than the massive limestone blocks lying shattered at his feet. The Roman fire could consume the cedar beams and the silk veils, but it could not reach the letters written in ink. The faith was moving from stone to spirit, migrating from a map of a city to the landscape of the heart. We see Eleazar years later, his face lined with the passage of decades and his hair turned the color of ash. He sits in the quiet shade of a Galilee olive grove, far from the white heat and screaming chaos of the Jerusalem he once served. His hands, once stained with the blood of sacrifices, now gently unroll a small darkened fragment of parchment. It is the same piece he carried out of the smoke, a few lines of the Torah preserved against all odds. Though the Temple Mount stands silent, a scorched platform of empty stone, the words under his fingers remain alive. He no longer wears the priestly linen, but in his study and his memory he still serves. The story of the fall of the Second Temple is, in the end, a story of how the invisible survives the destruction of the visible. Archaeology shows us the sheer scale of the Roman wrath, the cracked pavements, the toppled columns, and the charred skeletons in the burnt house. But history also shows us a people who refused to be buried under that rubble. The spiritual meaning of this tragedy is found in the realization that while structures of stone are inherently fragile, the truths they were built to house can endure any fire. It is a story of profound loss, yet it is also the account of a faith that learned to walk without a map of a city, finding its home instead in the rhythm of prayer and the endurance of the Word. If you want to continue this journey more deeply, my book is available through the link in the description. In the next episode, we will move to another moment where faith, imperial power, and historical evidence meet in a particularly sharp way.